The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before Rebecca Matthews as another contraction ripped through her body, yet her husband refused to pay the hospital bills for his pregnant wife, his voice cold as steel when he declared she wasn't worth the expense. Thomas Matthews stood beside his mistress, the nurse who'd been feeding him lies for months, their fingers intertwined while Rebecca clutched her swollen belly alone. What Thomas didn't know, what nobody in that sterile hallway could have imagined, was that the trembling woman he'd just abandoned was a secret trillionaire who'd been living modestly to test his love. And in the 72 hours since he'd walked away, she'd already bought the hospital his mistress worked in, transforming from victim to owner with a single phone call. When Thomas's mother arrived and laughed at Rebecca's pain, calling her worthless and barren despite the child she carried, Rebecca made a decision that would crush him and leave him devastated in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The nurse who'd stolen her husband would soon discover her employment terminated, yet that would be merely the opening move in a chess game where Rebecca held every piece. Thomas had gambled everything on a woman he'd underestimated, never suspecting that the quiet wife he'd dismissed had built an empire while he'd built nothing but betrayals. But what happens when a man who abandoned his wife for a mistress discovers the woman he discarded could buy his entire world? And when his mother's cruel laughter turns to desperate pleas, will Rebecca choose mercy or justice? What will Thomas do when he realizes the nurse he chose over his wife now has nothing, while the wife he rejected holds everything? This story teaches about the consequences of taking people for granted, the hidden strength in those we underestimate, and how arrogance blinds us to the value of what we have. You will learn that true character reveals itself in crisis, that material wealth means nothing without integrity, and that the people we hurt most are often the ones with the power to either save or destroy us. The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile symphony as Rebecca Matthews pressed her palm against the corridor wall, her water having broken 20 minutes earlier in the hospital parking lot. The contractions were coming faster now, each one a reminder that her body was preparing to bring new life into the world. But the man who'd helped create that life was preparing to walk away. Thomas stood 15 feet down the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear while his other hand rested on the small of another woman's back. Jessica Porter, the obstetrics nurse who'd been working the night shift when Thomas had brought Rebecca in for her first prenatal appointment 9 months ago. "I'm not paying for this," Thomas said loudly enough that the night receptionist looked up from her computer screen, her fingers freezing over the keyboard as she witnessed a moment that would become hospital legend within hours. "Rebecca has her own bank account. She can figure out how to cover a hospital bill." The words landed like physical blows, yet Rebecca remained standing through sheer force of will, her hand moving from the wall to cradle her belly as if she could shield her unborn child from the ugliness unfolding. She'd known for 6 weeks that Thomas was having an affair, the late nights at work conferences that her private investigator had documented with photographs so clear she could see Jessica's lipstick on his collar before he'd even walked through their apartment door. What Thomas didn't know, what nobody in this building except her attorney understood, was that Rebecca had been born Rebecca Sinclair, sole heir to the Sinclair Technologies fortune that had revolutionized medical software across 47 countries. Her grandfather had died 18 months ago, leaving her a trust fund worth $7 billion. But Rebecca had chosen silence over revelation, wanting to see if the man she'd married in a small courthouse ceremony would love her through what he perceived as financial struggle. She'd been working as a high school teacher, driving a 10-year-old sedan, clipping coupons at the grocery store while billions sat in accounts Thomas had never suspected existed. The test had been simple. Would he stay faithful when he thought she had nothing? Would his love survive what he believed was poverty? "Thomas, please," Rebecca managed between contractions, her voice carrying down the hallway despite her pain. "The baby's coming. I need you." Jessica whispered something in Thomas's ear, her hand sliding up his arm in a gesture of possession that made the receptionist's eyes widen further. Thomas looked at Rebecca as if she were a stranger begging for spare change, his expression shifting from indifference to active contempt in the space between heartbeats. "You need me?" Thomas laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet corridor where two other expectant mothers sat in wheelchairs, their husbands hovering, protectively, beside them. "I needed a wife who could keep herself together. I needed someone who didn't cry over every little inconvenience. Jessica's been more of a partner to me in 6 months than you've been in 5 years." The receptionist reached for her phone, clearly debating whether to call security, but Rebecca shook her head slightly in her direction, a gesture that said she could handle this degradation alone. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before, and she gripped the wall railing with both hands as her knees buckled slightly. Through the pain, through the humiliation of being abandoned in a hospital hallway while carrying her husband's child, Rebecca felt something crystallize inside her chest, a diamond-hard resolve that had been forming since she'd first seen those photographs of Thomas and Jessica kissing outside the restaurant where he'd claimed to be attending a business dinner. "Go then," Rebecca said, her voice steadier than she'd expected, the words emerging with a clarity that cut through her physical agony. "Leave, but understand that you're making a choice right now that you won't be able to undo." Thomas pulled Jessica closer, his arm circling her waist as if Rebecca's words were meaningless sounds rather than a prophecy that would reshape his entire existence. "I made my choice 6 months ago," he said, his tone suggesting he'd practiced this speech, refined it with Jessica during their stolen hours together. "I chose someone who actually wants to make me happy, instead of someone who just takes and never gives anything back." They walked toward the exit together, Jessica's soft-soled nurse shoes squeaking against the polished floor, Thomas's hand never leaving her body, as if he needed constant physical confirmation that she was real and Rebecca was just a nightmare he'd finally escaped. The automatic doors slid open, admitting a blast of cold November air that carried the scent of rain and dying leaves, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the hospital's bright entrance. Rebecca stood alone in the corridor, her contractions intensifying, her phone already in her hand with a text message drafted to her attorney. "Execute the hospital acquisition. I want ownership finalized by morning." The delivery room nurse, an older woman named Patricia, whose badge indicated 30 years of service, helped Rebecca into the bed with gentle efficiency, her eyes carrying the kind of sympathy that came from witnessing too many women abandoned at their most vulnerable moments. The monitors beeped steadily as Patricia attached them to Rebecca's belly, tracking the baby's heartbeat and the contractions that were now coming every 4 minutes, each one a crescendo of pain that Rebecca breathed through with a focus that impressed even the seasoned medical staff. "Your husband," Patricia began carefully, adjusting the IV line that would deliver fluids and eventually an epidural if Rebecca chose one. "Sometimes men get scared when things become real. Sometimes they come back." Rebecca met the nurse's eyes with a look that held no illusions, no desperate hope that Thomas would suddenly develop the character he'd proven he lacked. "He won't come back," she said, simply, her hand resting on her belly where her daughter, the ultrasounds had confirmed a girl 3 months ago, was preparing to enter a world that had already revealed its capacity for betrayal. "And I don't want him to." The statement hung in the air between them, a declaration of independence that Patricia recognized from decades of watching women transform in delivery rooms, their bodies performing miracles while their lives underwent equally dramatic changes. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from her attorney. Sinclair Holdings now owns St. Catherine's Medical Center, all documentation filed with the state, official announcement scheduled for 9 a.m. Congratulations on your acquisition and your impending motherhood." A smile touched Rebecca's lips, despite another contraction rolling through her body, a smile that contained no humor, but rather the cold satisfaction of a chess player who just positioned her queen for checkmate. St. Catherine's Medical Center employed 847 people across 4 buildings, generated $340 million in annual revenue, and counted among its staff one Jessica Porter, obstetrics nurse, whose employment file now sat on a server that Rebecca's company controlled completely. The door to the delivery room burst open with enough force to startle Patricia, who turned sharply toward the interruption, with her hand instinctively moving to shield her patient. Eleanor Matthews swept into the room like a winter storm given human form, her designer coat still buttoned against the November cold, her face arranged in an expression of disgust that she'd apparently been practicing during her drive from the Connecticut estate where she lived in the house Thomas's late father had purchased 40 years earlier. "So this is where my failure of a son has hidden himself," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the particular cruelty that only mothers who'd never wanted their children's spouses could perfect. Her eyes scanned the delivery room, noting Thomas's absence with visible satisfaction rather than concern. "Though I see he's finally developed some sense and left you to deal with this situation alone." Patricia stepped forward, her professional composure cracking slightly in the face of such overt malice toward a woman in active labor. "Ma'am, this is a delivery room, and your daughter-in-law is—" "She's not my daughter-in-law," Eleanor interrupted, moving closer to Rebecca's bed with the predatory grace of someone who'd spent decades wielding social status as a weapon. "She's the mistake my son made when he was too young to know better. A teacher." The word dripped with contempt, as if Rebecca's profession were evidence of moral failure rather than a calling that shaped young minds. "Thomas told me months ago that you couldn't even keep him interested in his own bed. What kind of woman loses her husband to a nurse?" Rebecca felt another contraction, building, but she kept her eyes locked on Eleanor's face, seeing in her mother-in-law's expression the same entitlement and cruelty that had shaped Thomas from childhood, that had taught him that people were disposable and loyalty was optional. Eleanor had never approved of their marriage. She'd skipped the courthouse ceremony entirely, sending a card with a check for $200 that bounced 3 days later, a deliberate insult that Thomas had laughed about as if his mother's cruelty were charming rather than pathological. "Where is Thomas?" Eleanor demanded, looking around the room as if her son might be hiding behind medical equipment. "Surely even he hasn't been stupid enough to actually abandon you during childbirth, though heaven knows you probably drove him to it with your constant neediness." "He left," Rebecca said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain that was making the monitors spike with each contraction. "He left with Jessica Porter, the nurse he's been sleeping with for the past 6 months. They walked out of this hospital together about 40 minutes ago." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and sudden, a sound without joy that seemed to suck warmth from the delivery room air. "Well, at least he's finally showing some backbone," she said, her hand adjusting the Hermes scarf at her throat, a casual gesture that revealed the $40,000 watch on her wrist, a fraction of the wealth she'd inherited when Thomas's father had died and left her everything except the emotional capacity to love her own son properly. "Jessica Porter is her name." "Good. At least Thomas has upgraded from a nobody teacher to someone who actually works in healthcare. Maybe she can give him the children he deserves instead of whatever disappointment you're about to produce." Patricia gasped audibly, her hand moving to the call button that would summon security, but Rebecca caught her wrist gently, shaking her head. "Don't," Rebecca said, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face as another contraction peaked and she breathed through it with visible control. "Let her talk. Let her say everything she's been holding back for 5 years. I want to remember this moment exactly as it is." Eleanor stepped closer to the bed, her smile widening as she mistook Rebecca's composure for weakness, for the passive acceptance she'd always demanded from anyone she considered beneath her social standing. "You want to remember this? The moment you realize you've lost everything." Eleanor's laugh came again, louder this time, filling the delivery room with its poisonous sound. "You're about to become a single mother with a teacher's salary, raising a child whose father didn't even care enough to stay for the birth. You have nothing, Rebecca. You are nothing. And now my son is free to build the life he actually deserves, with someone who—" "Your son," Rebecca interrupted, her voice cutting through. Eleanor's monologue with surgical precision just made the worst mistake of his life, and you, Eleanor, just made yours. The monitors beeped faster as Rebecca's contraction intensified, but her eyes remained locked on her mother-in-law's face, watching as confusion briefly crossed Eleanor's features, a momentary uncertainty that suggested some dormant survival instinct recognized that the woman in the hospital bed was not the helpless victim Eleanor had assumed she was crushing. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor demanded, but her voice had lost some of its confident cruelty, replaced by the first hint of something that might have been concern if Eleanor had been capable of such an emotion. Rebecca smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face despite the pain racking her body, and reached for the call button not to summon security, but to request her attorney's presence, knowing that what she did next would crush Thomas and leave him devastated in ways that would echo through the rest of his existence. Rebecca's daughter entered the world at 4:47 a.m. with a cry that pierced through the delivery room's controlled chaos, her tiny fists waving at the injustice of being pulled from warmth into cold, fluorescent reality. Patricia placed the baby on Rebecca's chest with tears streaming down her own face, having witnessed not just a birth but a woman's transformation from abandoned wife to something far more formidable over the past 6 hours. Eleanor had been banished to the waiting room after her cruel laughter, escorted out by security when she'd refused Patricia's polite request to leave, her protests about family rights falling on unsympathetic ears when the nurses had heard exactly what kind of family she represented. "She's perfect," Rebecca whispered against her daughter's dark hair, breathing in that indescribable newborn scent while her body trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline and the overwhelming love that flooded through her with physical force. "Lily, Grace, your name is Lily Grace, and you are everything." Her attorney, Margaret Chen, arrived as the morning shift nurses were completing their assessments, her briefcase containing documents that would detonate like precision bombs through Thomas's carefully constructed delusions. Margaret was 63 years old, had never lost a case in family court, and had been Rebecca's grandfather's personal attorney before his death, making her one of the few people who'd known Rebecca's true identity throughout her 5-year test of Thomas's character. "The hospital acquisition is complete," Margaret said quietly, standing beside Rebecca's bed while Lily nursed for the first time, her tiny mouth working instinctively at life's first lesson. "Sinclair Holdings now owns this entire medical complex. I've prepared termination paperwork for Jessica Porter, effective immediately, with cause listed as conduct unbecoming, after the night supervisor reported her unprofessional behavior in the corridor during your admission. She'll receive no severance, and her nursing license review has been flagged for the ethics board to examine her relationship with a patient's husband." Rebecca nodded, her hand supporting Lily's head with the instinctive gentleness that Margaret recognized from watching Rebecca's own mother, dead now for 15 years from the same cancer that had eventually claimed Rebecca's father, leaving her an orphan at 19 who'd inherited everything when her grandfather finally passed. "What about Thomas?" Rebecca asked, her voice carrying no anger now, only the cold calculation of someone executing a business strategy. "His mother's estate," Margaret continued, pulling documents from her briefcase with efficient movements, is heavily mortgaged. Eleanor Matthews owes $2.3 million against a property currently valued at $1.8 million in today's market. The bank holding that mortgage is Sinclair Financial Services, a subsidiary your grandfather established in 1987. I've prepared foreclosure proceedings to begin immediately, unless full payment is rendered within 30 days. The cruelty of it struck Rebecca with sudden force. She was becoming exactly what she'd accused Thomas of being, wielding power as a weapon, using money to destroy lives. But then Lily made a small sound against her breast, and Rebecca remembered standing alone in that corridor, abandoned while carrying this precious child, mocked by a woman who'd raised her son to believe that people were disposable. The moment of doubt passed like a shadow, replaced by resolve that felt less like revenge and more like justice finally finding its balance. "Execute it," Rebecca said, meeting Margaret's eyes with an understanding that passed between two women who'd both learned that mercy offered to cruel people was often just permission for further cruelty. "And I want Jessica Porter's termination to be public. Not cruel, but clear. The staff should understand that this hospital has new ownership and new standards." Margaret made notes on her tablet, her stylus moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Thomas has been calling the hospital every hour since 6 a.m., she added, her tone suggesting this information was significant. "The new receptionist has been instructed to inform him that his wife delivered successfully but is not accepting visitors. He's become increasingly agitated according to the security logs. Apparently, Jessica Porter called him at 5:30 a.m. after receiving her termination notice, and he's been trying to reach hospital administration ever since to contest her firing." Rebecca's laugh was soft and bitter, a sound that held no joy, but rather the recognition of a pattern completing itself. "He wasn't worried about his daughter being born," she said, adjusting Lily's position so the baby could nurse more comfortably. "He's worried about his mistress losing her job. That tells you everything you need to know about what he values." The door opened suddenly, and Eleanor Matthews pushed past the nurse who'd tried to stop her, her face flushed with fury that seemed to have intensified overnight rather than cooled. "You little witch," Eleanor spat, her designer coat from last night replaced with different expensive clothes that suggested she'd gone home to change before returning for round 2 of her assault. "Jessica Porter just called Thomas in hysterics because she's been fired, and the hospital is claiming it's because of new ownership policies. What did you do? Did you complain to hospital administration? Did you try to destroy that poor girl's career because you couldn't keep your own husband satisfied?" Patricia moved to intervene, but Rebecca raised her hand in a gesture that stopped the nurse mid-step, a gesture that carried authority Eleanor was only beginning to recognize. "Margaret," Rebecca said calmly, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face while Lily continued nursing peacefully against her chest. "Would you please explain to Mrs. Matthews who owns this hospital?" Margaret stepped forward with the document still in her hand, her expression professionally neutral despite the satisfaction Rebecca could see flickering in her eyes. "As of 6 a.m. this morning, St. Catherine's Medical Center is wholly owned by Sinclair Holdings, a private medical investment company worth approximately $12 billion across 17 states. The principal owner and CEO of Sinclair Holdings is Rebecca Sinclair Matthews, formerly Rebecca Sinclair, heir to the Sinclair Technologies fortune established by her grandfather David Sinclair, who passed away 18 months ago, leaving her the entirety of his estate, valued at $3.7 billion in liquid assets alone." The color drained from Eleanor's face so rapidly that Patricia instinctively stepped closer, clearly worried the woman might actually faint. "That's impossible," Eleanor whispered, her hand gripping the door frame as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. "Rebecca is a teacher. She drives a Toyota. She uses grocery store coupons. She's nobody." "She was testing your son," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the same tone she used in courtrooms when delivering closing arguments that destroyed opposing counsel's carefully built cases, testing whether he would remain faithful when he believed she had nothing. He failed that test spectacularly, as did you, Mrs. Matthews, when you mocked her for being worthless while she was in active labor with your granddaughter. Rebecca watched emotions cascade across Eleanor's face, disbelief shifting to comprehension, comprehension transforming into horror, horror crystallizing into the desperate panic of someone who just realized they'd burned a bridge they actually needed. "Rebecca," Eleanor began, her voice cracking in ways Rebecca had never heard before, the imperious cruelty replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "I didn't know. If I had known who you really were, I never would have—" "Said all those things?" Rebecca finished, her voice soft but sharp as surgical steel. "Laughed at me while I was in pain, called me worthless and nothing, told me I'd driven your son away?" Lily had finished nursing and now slept against Rebecca's chest, her tiny face peaceful and perfect, unaware that her existence had triggered a war that would reshape multiple lives. "The problem, Eleanor, isn't that you said those things to someone rich. The problem is that you said them at all, to anyone, regardless of their bank account." Thomas arrived at noon with desperation etched into every line of his face, his clothes rumpled from a sleepless night, spent alternating between Jessica's frantic phone calls and his own growing comprehension that something had shifted in ways he couldn't yet fully grasp. The security guard at the maternity ward entrance checked his identification with unusual thoroughness, making a phone call that lasted 3 full minutes while Thomas shifted his weight from foot to foot, his anxiety manifesting in physical restlessness that suggested his body understood what his mind was still refusing to accept. "You can go in," the guard finally said, his tone carefully neutral in the way that suggested he'd been briefed on exactly who Thomas Matthews was and what he'd done. "Room 412, but sir, Mrs. Matthews has requested that your visit be supervised and limited to 15 minutes. The words Mrs. Matthews landed strangely in Thomas's ears, as if his wife had become someone he no longer recognized, transformed from the woman he'd abandoned into an entity with the power to set terms on his own access to his child. He walked down the corridor where Rebecca had stood alone just yesterday, his footsteps echoing against polished floors that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite having walked through this hospital dozens of times while Jessica worked her shifts. Rebecca sat propped against pillows in the private room, her dark hair brushed and pulled back, wearing clothes that Thomas had never seen before, expensive fabrics that his wife shouldn't have been able to afford on a teacher's salary. Lily slept in the clear hospital bassinet beside the bed, tiny and perfect and completely unaware that her father was meeting her for the first time. Margaret Chen stood near the window with another man Thomas didn't recognize, both of them holding tablets and wearing expressions that trial lawyers wore when they knew they held winning hands. "Rebecca," Thomas began, moving toward the bed with his hands extended as if to bridge the distance his betrayal had created. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I was scared and stupid, and Jessica was telling me things that made me doubt everything, and I know I hurt you, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling and—" "Stop," Rebecca said quietly, the single word carrying enough weight that Thomas's forward motion halted, as if he'd hit an invisible wall. "You're not sorry you hurt me, Thomas. You're sorry you made a mistake. There's a difference." "What are you talking about?" Thomas's voice rose with frustration, born from sleep deprivation and the growing sense that he'd wandered into a game whose rules had changed without warning. "Of course I'm sorry I hurt you. That's what I just said. I want to make this right. I want to meet our daughter properly and be a family and—" "Your mother's estate is being foreclosed on," Rebecca interrupted, her tone conversational despite the bomb she'd just detonated in the small hospital room. "Sinclair Financial Services holds her mortgage $2.3 million against a property worth substantially less. She has 30 days to pay in full or lose everything. Jessica Porter has been terminated from her position here at St. Catherine's Medical Center for conduct unbecoming, and her nursing license is under ethics review for engaging in a relationship with a patient's spouse. And you, Thomas, are about to sign divorce papers that will give you supervised visitation with Lily, but nothing else. Thomas stared at his wife as if she'd begun speaking a foreign language, his brain struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd married and abandoned. "How do you know about my mother's mortgage?" he asked, latching onto the one detail he could almost understand. "And you can't get Jessica fired just because you're angry. That's not how hospitals work. They have procedures that the owner can modify," Margaret interjected smoothly, stepping away from the window to stand beside Rebecca's bed with the protective presence of someone defending a client who'd already won. "Perhaps I should introduce myself. Margaret Chen, senior attorney for Sinclair Holdings. My client, Rebecca Sinclair Matthews, owns this hospital as of yesterday morning, along with 16 other medical facilities across 4 states and approximately $12 billion in additional assets." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, visible and choking and impossible to wave away. Thomas's legs seemed to lose their structural integrity, and he reached for the chair beside Rebecca's bed, sinking into it with the graceless collapse of a puppet whose strings had been cut. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction because pieces were clicking into place in his mind. Rebecca's mysterious family she never discussed. The grandmother's antique ring she wore that looked too expensive to be real. The way she'd never seemed genuinely worried about money despite living on a teacher's salary. "My grandfather was David Sinclair," Rebecca said, watching her husband's face as comprehension slowly replaced denial. "Sinclair Technologies, Sinclair Medical Software, Sinclair Financial Services. He died 18 months ago and left me everything. But I didn't tell you because I wanted to know if you'd stay faithful when you thought we had nothing. I wanted to see if the man I married actually loved me or if he just loved the idea of me." Thomas's hands shook as he gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white with pressure that couldn't contain the tremors running through his body. "You tested me?" The question emerged strangled, caught between outrage and dawning horror. "You had billions of dollars, and you made us live in that apartment and drive that car and shop with coupons just to test me?" "I made us live like normal people," Rebecca corrected, her voice hardening with the first real anger Thomas had heard from her since he'd entered the room. "I wanted a partnership built on love instead of money. I wanted to know that if everything disappeared tomorrow, you'd still be standing beside me. And you weren't, Thomas. The moment Jessica Porter whispered in your ear that you deserved better, the moment she made you feel important and desired, you threw away 5 years of marriage without even trying to fight for it." Lily stirred in her bassinet, making the small sounds that newborns make when approaching consciousness, and Thomas instinctively reached toward her, but stopped when Rebecca's expression froze him in place. "You abandoned her before she was born," Rebecca said, her hand moving to adjust Lily's blanket with the protective gentleness Thomas had forfeited his right to claim. "You told hospital staff I wasn't worth the expense of delivery. You held another woman's hand in the corridor where I stood in labor. Your mother laughed at my pain and called me worthless. And now you want to be a family." "I made a mistake," Thomas pleaded, tears streaming down his face now as the full magnitude of what he'd lost became real in ways abstract knowledge couldn't match. "People make mistakes. You could have told me the truth. You could have said who you really were, and none of this would have happened." "You're right," Rebecca agreed, her voice soft but implacable as stone. "If you'd known I was rich, you would have stayed faithful. That's exactly my point, Thomas. You would have loved my money, not me. and I'd rather be alone with a daughter who I can raise to understand that character matters more than bank accounts, than spend another day with a man who sees people as opportunities to exploit. Margaret stepped forward with documents that bore official seals and legal language that would reshape Thomas's entire existence. These are divorce papers with a custody arrangement that gives you supervised visitation every other weekend once Lily is 6 months old. You'll pay child support based on your actual income, not Rebecca's. You'll have no claim to any of her assets, as you signed a prenuptial agreement on your wedding day that you apparently didn't read carefully because you were too focused on the free bar at the courthouse reception. Thomas's mind reeled backward 5 years to the simple ceremony. The document someone, probably Margaret, had handed him with assurances it was standard paperwork. His hasty signature because Rebecca had been waiting and beautiful, and he'd been 23 and stupid and certain that love was enough. The prenup, he whispered, memory crystallizing into another layer of devastation. I signed away everything before I even knew there was anything to sign away. My grandfather insisted, Rebecca said, picking up Lily as the baby began to fuss, holding her daughter against her shoulder with the natural confidence that some women possessed from their first moment of motherhood. He said anyone who truly loved me would sign without hesitation because they wouldn't be marrying me for money. You proved him right, Thomas. You signed because you thought I had nothing worth protecting. Eleanor appeared in the doorway then, her face bearing none of yesterday's cruelty, but instead wearing the desperate mask of someone who'd spent the morning with her own attorneys, learning exactly how thoroughly she'd destroyed her own life. Rebecca, please, Eleanor began, but Rebecca raised her hand in the same gesture that had stopped Patricia yesterday, a gesture that now carried the weight of billions behind it. Your foreclosure stands, Rebecca said, simply her attention focused on Lily rather than her mother-in-law, refusing to even grant Eleanor the dignity of eye contact during her begging. You taught your son that people are disposable, that cruelty is acceptable, that money and status matter more than character. I'm teaching my daughter something different, and that lesson starts with consequences for people who hurt others and then expect forgiveness simply because they finally understand who they're dealing with. Thomas stood on shaking legs, the divorce papers clutched in his hand like evidence of his own execution, his eyes moving between his wife and his daughter and his mother, 3 generations of women whose lives he'd irrevocably altered through his choices. What about Jessica? He asked, the question pathetic in its timing, revealing that even now, even crushed and devastated, part of him was still thinking about the woman he'd chosen over his family. Rebecca finally looked at him then, really, looked at him with eyes that held no love anymore, but also no hatred, just the cool assessment of someone observing a stranger who'd briefly passed through her life. Jessica is no longer your concern or mine, she said. She made her choices just as you made yours. Now you both get to live with the consequences, while Lily and I build a life that doesn't include people who measure worth in dollars and see loyalty as negotiable. The security guard appeared in the doorway, his timing suggesting he'd been listening for his cue. Sir, ma'am, your 15 minutes are complete. I need to ask you to leave. Thomas walked toward the door with the shuffling gait of someone who'd aged decades in minutes, Eleanor following behind him with her designer clothes and her ruined life and her son who'd learned cruelty so well from her teaching. At the threshold, Thomas turned back one final time, his mouth opening as if to say something that might matter, but Rebecca had already turned away, her attention fully on Lily, whispering promises against her daughter's soft hair about the life they would build together, a life where character would always matter more than convenience, where love would be proven through loyalty rather than convenience, and where the people who'd laughed at their vulnerability would serve as cautionary tales rather than family. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silence it created, and Rebecca held her daughter closer, knowing that she'd crushed him and left him devastated, but feeling no guilt for delivering consequences he'd earned through every choice he'd made, every betrayal he'd committed, every moment he'd chosen to see her as worthless when she'd actually been priceless all along. The autumn sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows in the executive suite of Sinclair Holdings headquarters, casting golden patterns across the Persian rug where 3-year-old Lily Grace Matthews played with wooden blocks, constructing towers with the focused determination her mother recognized as a family trait. Rebecca stood at the window overlooking the city skyline, her reflection showing a woman who'd grown into her power rather than being consumed by it, still kind but no longer testing that kindness against people who'd proven themselves unworthy. "Mama, look!" Lily called out, her voice carrying the pure joy of a child who'd never known abandonment, who'd been raised surrounded by love that asked for nothing except her happiness. "I made it taller than me." Rebecca turned from the window and knelt beside her daughter, admiring the precarious tower that defied gravity through sheer toddler stubbornness. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, tucking a strand of dark hair behind Lily's ear, hair that matched her own rather than Thomas's lighter coloring, a genetic gift that sometimes felt like the universe's small mercy. "You're an architect like your great-grandfather was, building things that reach toward the sky." Margaret Chen entered the office with her ever-present tablet, her expression carrying the satisfaction of an attorney who'd spent 3 years watching her client not just survive, but flourish after devastation. "The quarterly reports are remarkable," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Rebecca's desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become more friend than counsel. St. Catherine's Medical Center has increased patient satisfaction scores by 47% since you implemented the new staff training programs, and employee retention is up 63% across all 17 facilities. Rebecca smiled at the numbers that represented more than profit margins. They represented lives improved, medical professionals who felt valued, patients who received care with dignity, rather than viewing healthcare as a transaction where only money mattered. "What about the scholarship fund?" she asked, knowing the answer would bring the kind of satisfaction that wealth alone could never provide. "Fully funded through 2030, Margaret replied, pulling up documents on her tablet. "The Lily Grace Matthews Nursing Scholarship has awarded full tuition to 127 nursing students from low-income backgrounds, with a requirement that they work in underserved communities for at least 3 years after graduation. Several of your scholarship recipients are now working at St. Catherine's, actually. You met 2 of them during last month's hospital tour." The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca that she'd created opportunities for nurses while Jessica Porter had lost everything she'd stolen, though Rebecca rarely thought about the woman who'd helped destroy her marriage anymore. Jessica had moved to another state according to the private investigator's final report 2 years ago. Her nursing license reinstated after the ethics review, but her reputation damaged enough that finding work had required geographic escape. Rebecca had stopped tracking her after that report, recognizing that true healing meant releasing the people who'd hurt her, rather than holding them in perpetual observation. "And Thomas?" Rebecca asked, the name emerging with less pain than it once had, transformed over 3 years from a wound that bled to a scar that simply existed as evidence of survival. Margaret's expression shifted slightly, taking on the careful neutrality that suggested the news would be complicated rather than simple. "He's requested another modification to the custody arrangement," she said, her tone suggesting she'd already reviewed the request and found it wanting. "He wants to increase visitation to include overnight stays now that Lily is 3. His attorney argues he's been consistent with supervised visits and has completed the parenting classes the court mandated." Rebecca watched Lily stack another block on her tower, the little girl's tongue poking out in concentration as she balanced the piece just so and felt the familiar tension that always accompanied decisions about Thomas's access to their daughter. He'd been present for every supervised visit over the past 2.5 years. That much was true, showing up on time and playing with Lily with what appeared to be genuine affection during their carefully monitored hours together. But Rebecca had also received reports from the supervisors about his attempts to ask Lily questions about Mama's house and Mama's money, subtle probings that suggested Thomas was still more interested in Rebecca's wealth than in building authentic connection with his daughter. "What does the custody evaluator recommend?" Rebecca asked, trusting professional assessment over her own complicated feelings about the man who'd abandoned her in a hospital corridor. "Dr. Morrison suggests we maintain supervised visits for another 6 months," Margaret said, reading from the evaluator's report on her tablet. She notes that Thomas demonstrates appropriate interaction with Lily during visits, but expresses concern about his motivation. He's asked Lily multiple times if she'd like to come live with Daddy in a big house, despite knowing the custody arrangement doesn't allow for that discussion. Dr. Morrison believes he's attempting to manipulate Lily's preferences rather than accepting the consequences of his original abandonment. Rebecca nodded slowly, recognizing the pattern that Thomas had never truly broken, still trying to take shortcuts, still believing he could charm or manipulate his way past accountability, still fundamentally unable to understand that some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt regardless of how much he wanted to cross back over them. "Deny the modification," she said finally, her voice carrying the certainty that came from choosing her daughter's well-being over Thomas's desires. "Tell his attorney that when Lily is old enough to express her own preferences clearly, maybe around age 7 or 8, we'll revisit overnight visitation if Dr. Morrison recommends it then." Margaret made notes on her tablet with a small smile that suggested this was exactly the decision she'd expected and approved. "And Eleanor?" she asked, the question carrying weight because Eleanor Matthews had been calling Rebecca's office monthly for the past year, her requests for contact growing increasingly desperate as her circumstances deteriorated. "Still no," Rebecca said, though the answer came with more complexity than it once had, tinged now with something that might have been pity if Rebecca allowed herself to feel sympathy for a woman who'd laughed at her pain. She made her choices. She taught her son cruelty and then practiced it herself when she thought I was powerless. The foreclosure was completed 18 months ago. She's living in a rental apartment on her Social Security and whatever money Thomas gives her from his salary at the marketing firm. That's consequence, not cruelty. But even as Rebecca spoke the words, she felt Lily's small hand on her knee, the little girl having abandoned her blocks to lean against her mother with the instinctive awareness that children possessed when adult conversations turned serious. "Mama sad?" Lily asked, her brown eyes, so much like Rebecca's own, searching her mother's face with concern that squeezed Rebecca's heart. "Not sad, baby," Rebecca said, lifting Lily into her lap and holding her close, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence that reminded her why every difficult decision mattered. "Just thinking about grown-up things, but you know what? I'm happy. So very happy because I have you." Margaret stood to leave, recognizing a moment between mother and daughter that didn't require witness but paused at the door with one final piece of information. "There's something else," she said carefully, her hesitation suggesting the news would be significant. "Thomas is getting married to someone named Amanda Prescott. She works in accounting at his firm. The wedding is next month. His attorney wanted you to know in case it affects Lily's visitation schedule." Rebecca absorbed the information with surprising calm, realizing that what she felt wasn't jealousy or even satisfaction, but rather a distant hope that perhaps Thomas had finally learned something from losing everything. Does he love her? Rebecca asked, the question genuine rather than bitter. Or does he love what she represents? A fresh start, a woman who doesn't know what he's capable of when things get difficult? The investigator's report suggests genuine affection, Margaret replied, though her tone indicated skepticism born from knowing Thomas's history. Amanda doesn't come from money. She's working her way through night school for her CPA certification. They've been together for 14 months, and by all accounts, Thomas has been faithful and attentive. Whether that's because he's changed or because he's learned to be more careful with his betrayals remains to be seen. After Margaret left, Rebecca sat at her desk with Lily in her lap, both of them watching the city move beyond the windows, cars navigating streets, people pursuing their lives, the constant motion of a world that continued regardless of individual triumph or tragedy. She thought about Thomas getting remarried and realized she genuinely hoped it worked for him, not because she'd forgiven him, but because Lily deserved a father who'd learned to be better, who'd grown from his mistakes rather than simply repeating them with new victims. "Tell me about great-grandpa David," Lily requested, as she often did during their quiet moments together, hungry for stories about the man whose fortune had changed their lives, but whose real legacy was the lesson that character mattered more than wealth. Rebecca smiled and began the familiar story about a man who'd built an empire but measured his success by the people he'd helped rather than the money he'd accumulated, about a grandfather who'd insisted on the prenuptial agreement not to protect his money but to protect his granddaughter's heart from people who would love her bank account more than her soul. Lily listened with rapt attention, her small fingers tracing patterns on Rebecca's hand, and Rebecca felt grateful, not for the billions she'd inherited, but for the wisdom that had come with them, for the test that had revealed Thomas's true nature before she'd wasted more years on a man incapable of genuine partnership. The sun shifted lower in the sky, painting the office in shades of amber and gold, and Rebecca held her daughter closer, thinking about Eleanor in her small apartment, about Thomas planning a wedding to a woman he hopefully valued more than he'd valued his first wife, about Jessica Porter somewhere trying to rebuild a life she'd demolished through poor choices. She felt no triumph in their struggles, but she felt no guilt either, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd survived betrayal, claimed her power, and chosen to wield it with justice rather than vengeance. "Mama," Lily said sleepily, her afternoon energy finally fading as she nestled against Rebecca's chest. "Are you a princess?" Rebecca laughed softly, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "No, sweetheart, I'm not a princess. I'm just a woman who learned that you can't test love without risking that it will fail. The test. I'm someone who discovered that the people who hurt us teach us what we deserve by showing us what we don't. And I'm your mama, which is the most important thing I'll ever be." Lily's response was a contented sigh as she drifted towards sleep, her small body going heavy with the absolute trust that children gave to parents who'd proven themselves worthy of that faith. Rebecca sat in her executive suite, worth millions, holding a daughter worth infinitely more, and understood that the story that had begun with abandonment in a hospital corridor had transformed into something far more valuable than revenge. It had become a testament to survival, to the strength found in choosing dignity over bitterness, and to the truth that sometimes the cruelest betrayals led to the greatest freedoms. Outside the windows, the city continued its eternal rhythm, full of people making choices that would define their futures, some learning the lessons Rebecca had learned and others repeating the mistakes Thomas had made. But in that moment, in that golden autumn light, Rebecca held her daughter and felt nothing but peace, the kind of peace that came from knowing she'd been tested by fire and emerged not as ash, but as something stronger, refined and purified, and finally, completely free. The phone on her desk buzzed with a message from the hospital foundation. Another former patient wanted to thank her personally for the care they'd received. Another life touched by the changes she'd implemented. Another reminder that wealth wielded with compassion could heal more than just balance sheets. Rebecca smiled and made a mental note to call them back after Lily woke from her nap, after they'd gone home to the penthouse apartment overlooking the park, after they'd had dinner and read stories and lived another day of the beautiful life they'd built from the ruins of betrayal. Because that was the real epilogue, Rebecca thought, not what happened to the people who'd hurt her, but what she'd built despite them. Not the devastation she'd caused Thomas and Eleanor, but the foundation she'd laid for Lily, teaching her daughter through action rather than words. That character always mattered more than circumstance. That dignity could coexist with power, and that sometimes the greatest revenge was simply living well, loving deeply, and refusing to let those who'd underestimated you define what you were capable of becoming. The tower of blocks Lily had built stood on the rug, precarious but standing, reaching toward the ceiling with the same determination Rebecca recognized in herself. Built from simple pieces, defying gravity through sheer will, and beautiful precisely because it had been constructed by hands that didn't yet understand the word impossible.